Good day, everyone, and a warm welcome to all joining us for Around the World. Whether you're starting your morning in the middle of your workday or winding down for the evening, we are delighted that you have made time to be part of today's conversation on Skill First Policy and Impact. I'm Paul, your host for today's Roundtable. This webinar is organized by Institute for Adult Learning, IAL, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. We have brought together a group of top leaders and policymakers who are shaping how skill-first approaches are taking root globally. It is a great chance for all of us to hear different perspectives and think about how this idea can help build more agile, inclusive, and future-ready workforce ecosystem. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded. We kindly ask that you avoid quoting or attributing any remark to individual or organization unless you have their permission. Feel free to send in your question anytime through the Zoom Q&A. Our panelists will attempt to address some of them during the discussion. You may also upvote the question that you would like to be addressed during the panel discussion. Let's keep the conversation respectful and constructive. If you run into any technical issue, just drop a message in the chat and our team will assist you. And finally, if you'd like to refer to the Skill First Working Paper 4, authored by Associate Professor Terence Ho, Professor Bani Glover, and Dr. Eliza Mohamedou, you can scan the QR code on the screen to access the infographic and the full document. With that, I would like to invite Mr. Edwin Tan, Director of the Center for Skill First Practices at the Institute for Adult Learning, to deliver our opening remarks. Edwin, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining from multiple time zones around the world. To begin, I would like to express my appreciation to Associate Professor Terence, Professor Bani, and Dr. Eliza for writing the paper that forms the foundation of today's roundtable discussion. Their work has given us a thoughtful starting point and a framework for an engaging conversation today. I would also like to thank the panelists who made time to be with us today. Policymakers play a critical role in fostering a truly skills-first ecosystem by shaping the rules, incentives, and infrastructure that make skills visible, valued, and portable across the labor market. Through effective industrial, labor, and skills policies, policymakers can help shift hiring and workforce development away from rigid credential requirements and towards demonstrable competencies. And importantly, policymakers can also convene employers, educators, and training providers to align on shared definitions of skills and ensure that opportunities are accessible to all. In so doing, we hope to create more inclusive and agile workforces and more resilient economies around the world. On that note, I would like to thank you all again for being here and for contributing your time and perspectives to this roundtable. I look forward to the ideas, questions, and insights that will emerge today. Thank you, and I wish everyone a truly fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Edwin. Now, it is my pleasure to invite two of the three co-authors of Skill First Working Paper 4 to share some of the key ideas. Professor Bani Glover, Commissioner Job and Skill Australia, Dr. Eliza Mohamedou, Head of the Center for Skill OECD. They will walk us through the paper key insights, including the coordination across industrial, labor, and skill policies, roles that government can play, and critical questions that all policymakers should consider. Over to the presenter, please.
Thank you, Paul. And can I also provide my welcome to everyone who's online. It's an exciting night for those of us who have been working on this working paper for some time. And I do want to congratulate the Institute for Adult Learning and the Centre for Skills First Practices for the enormous amount of work that's gone into bringing this together. I think it's a very timely and important working paper, and very pleased to be able to say a few words about some of the key messages, some of the key aspects and ideas from working paper number 4, Skills First Policy and Impact. The core proposition here actually is quite simple and straightforward, but truly, in our view, transformative. If we treat skills as the primary currency of the labour market and embed that logically across industrial labour and skills policy, we can close persistent gaps between training capability and quality jobs. And our discussion translates this into practical levers and roles for government, with lessons from economies already taking steps in this direction. I think that's a key point. Edwin mentioned resilience a little earlier. It's a key aspect of this work, I think, to provide insights that are already in train from various governments and economies around the world. So, first of all, why skills first matters and why now? And certainly the very clear message from this working paper is the policy imperative is an urgent one. There is a need for action. Disruption from technology, from demography, from geopolitics is outplacing qualification-centric systems around the world. So we're all encountering disruption in a variety of ways. We'll recognise the impact that it is having, and we need to ensure that our policy frame is able to adapt quickly and responsibly and hopefully impactfully to that disruption. We see a transformation gap, simultaneously shortages in new domains alongside underutilised skills among displaced workers. Employers reporting shortages of skills as a major barrier to transformation, especially in the tech, data and green skills space. So we see, and certainly this is true in Australia, my country, Jobs and Skills Australia, shortages in our case across about 29% of occupations in our economy, and of course growing new areas and new domains requiring new skills, and increasingly seeing this skills first agenda emerging. A skills first orientation enables precision, not just more training, but targeted capability building, redeployment pathways and work redesign that make latent skills visible and usable. And I wanted to stress the importance of that. In times of disruption and where we're seeking resilience, we need to find ways to help those people displaced in our labour market find the skills they need to reposition themselves and to recognise the skills they have as pathways through work redesign and other areas into the labour market more broadly. We go to the next slide. So there are three foundations that we discuss in the report. Anchoring skills first as a concept across these three foundations. Now, the first one, importantly, is to have a common language of skills, standardized, machine-readable taxonomies that map jobs, tasks, skills, so everyone speaks the same language, everyone is using the same vocabulary. It's something that Jobs and Skills Australia, we're very interested in as we attempt to develop our national skills taxonomy, that we carefully consider the definition of a skill and we make sure we build our taxonomy accordingly. So that common language is crucial, particularly in the globalised context tonight, where we have so many people from so many parts of the world participating. Second, we need validated signalling, trusted mechanisms to recognise skills regardless of how they're acquired, making capabilities portable across employers and sectors. Skills must be recognised regardless of learning pathway. So one of the fundamentals of skills first. But we do need the validation and we do need those trusted pathways. But it's really to recognise that how skills might be acquired is not the key factor. It's having those skills, trusted skills, recognised through trusted mechanisms. That could be through formal education, as we know, the importance of qualifications and credentials, through workplace learning, through micro-credentials, micro-skills, work experience, and the informal and less formal, non-formal pathways of learning that influence the skills of individuals. Validation infrastructure makes skills visible, portable and actionable in the hiring, in the promotion, the recruitment, the promotion, and the mobility decisions. Labour market mobility is a major focus here in Australia as we try and encourage greater mobility in what is at the moment sluggish in the Australian economy. So validation is critical, common language is critical, and to recognise our skills as a dynamic asset, capabilities that must be continually developed, refreshed and redeployed using real-time labour market intelligence and adaptive learning ecosystems. Skills should not be treated as fixed qualifications or inventories. One of the great challenges we all have in our national skills systems and wherever we are in the world is ensuring that we are confident about the currency relevance of our learning instruments, and to ensure that when we update them, we do it carefully and in consultation with key social partners, whether they be governments, whether they be business, whether they be unions. We need to have that confidence, but we need to be doing that in a very dynamic way in the context of a skills-first economic transformation. This reflects a world where technology, job tasks, and economic structures change more rapidly, requiring regular updating and redeployment of capabilities. And when you think about the disruption we spoke about a moment ago, that's going to be critical. We think about the disruption of generative AI and agentic AI at the moment. So there are those three foundations. Let's talk a little bit more about one of the problems on the next slide. Fragmentation. Well-intentioned policies fail when they're not coordinated and they're not cohesive. So let's talk that through across these really important policy domains. Despite many good initiatives, fragmentation limits impact. Industrial policy tends to incentivise capital and job counts with weaker links to domestic capability building. Capability mandates require lead firms to invest in developing the capabilities of suppliers and their own workforce across the value chain, strengthening domestic skills ecosystems and supporting high quality, transformation-aligned job creation. Labour policy often buffers transitions but doesn't systematically enable mobility or skills-based hiring. Labour policy must evolve to actively support mobility and skills-based hiring through digital credentials, transition mapping, and skills-centred recruitment and work design, shifting the system from protecting workers in jobs, which is crucial, to enabling workers to move confidently between them, confidence and mobility being crucial. And then the skills policy dimension. Skills policy expands training supply, yet too little emphasis ensures those capabilities are actually deployed in work. The result, training is not deployment. Skills policy must evolve from expanding training supply to ensuring that skills are validated, targeted, deployed, and aligned with economic transformation. Through precision upskilling, skills-based pathways, trusted validation systems, and strong coordination with labour and industrial policy. A coordinated skills-first approach aims to realign these domains so they reinforce one another. So better cohesion, better collaboration, and better coordination across the policy development frame, industrial, labour, and skills policy, critical to that. Let's talk a little bit about the solution on the next slide. Our solution lens in the working paper is ecosystemic. That is, embedding skills-first principles across those domains of industrial, labour and skills policy. So incentives, standards and data points are in the same direction. They're working together. Systemic integration means coherent, aligned, whole of government and multi-stakeholder coordination across the industrial, labour and skills policies. In the Australian context with Jobs and Skills Australia, we're a tripartite agency. So we work very much collaboratively across the social partners engaged in our skills system and in our labour market. That's essential to enabling a skills-first economy, correcting structural inefficiencies, and ensuring that skills are developed, validated, and deployed in ways that support economic transformation. Integration is the lever that turns many disconnected good things that are happening, and there are many good things happening in all of our economies, into one coherent capability system. Now, I'd like to hand over now to my co-presenter, Dr. Eliza Mohamedou from the Centre for Skills in the OECD. Eliza, over to you.
Thanks, Barney. So as Barney just mentioned, we did look into industrial policy and policy transformation, and industrial policy has traditionally focused on job creation and capital investment. But in a skills-driven economy, jobs alone are no longer enough. So what matters is really whether industries are developing the capabilities required to stay competitive. So the skills-first industrial policy creates incentives for firms to invest in people by conditioning subsidies and tax benefits on tangible capability development. So we see this in initiatives like Denmark's adult apprenticeship subsidy scheme, where employees receive state-funded wage subsidies for taking on adult apprentices in high-demand fields. And we see this as well in France's compte personnel de formation, so the individual learning accounts, where employers make mandatory deposits into a virtual training account for each worker. We also need to build cluster-based skills ecosystems. And so these kinds of environments where firms, training institutions, and innovations actors work together to develop shared capabilities. And these ecosystems actually speed up skills development because they pool resources, they align training with real industrial needs, and they accelerate knowledge diffusion across firms. And Canada's innovation superclusters is another good example of how this approach can boost both innovation and workforce capabilities. We also looked at value chain mandates as another lever, because by ensuring that large firms help raise the skills base of their suppliers, not only their employees. And so Singapore's PACT system is another relevant example in institutionalizing collaboration between lead firms and smaller enterprises to transfer knowledge, strengthening supplier capabilities, and enhancing productivity across the entire ecosystem. And finally, we also must track not just whether jobs are created, but whether skills are actually being deployed. And that's where a skills-first readiness and adoption index helps assess whether countries are building the full workforce capabilities required for future competitiveness. In the next slide, we looked as well at labor policy transformation. And so precisely as Barney was mentioning, in labor markets that are disrupted by technology and demographic change, protecting jobs is no longer the only priority. Supporting people's mobility and resilience is just as important. So this skills-first approach focuses on matching workers to opportunities based on what they can do, not the credentials they possess. And that's platforms, skills-based hiring platforms like Pinpoint or Gap Jumpers show that widening criteria beyond degrees can actually unlock much larger talent pools. And our recent OECD report shows that this shift is also visible in recruiter search behavior on digital platforms. So recruiters are increasingly filtering and ranking candidates based on explicitly signaled skills rather than formal degrees. And on platforms like LinkedIn, for instance, a growing share of recruiter searchers rely on skills criteria, either alone or in combination with education. That reflects really this move towards more granular capability-based screening. There's also portable skills accounts or individual skills wallets that give workers ownership over their learning by enabling them for continuous development across jobs and sectors. And Europe's digital credentials initiatives and India's digital skills hub are also interesting examples here. We also need transition mapping so workers can see viable pathways from declining occupations into growing ones. And the US Opportunity Work Star framework, for instance, also highlights how millions of workers skilled through alternative routes already have the capabilities to move into better paying roles. And then we also looked into labor protections that must also evolve to ensure fair work through effective skills use, because when workers' capabilities are underutilized, it isn't just a personal frustration, it's also a form of labor market inefficiency. So underutilization wastes human capital, it lowers productivity, it reduces wage growth, and it weakens the firm's ability to innovate ultimately. So this means really that regulators and social partners increasingly need to focus not only on how workers are treated, but also on how well their skills are deployed in workplaces. So addressing underutilization involves encouraging job redesign. It also means improving task allocation, ensuring that workers who acquire new skills can actually use them meaningfully at work. And there are quite a few examples, but a useful one comes from Singapore's work redesign project, which supports firms to analyze job roles, redesign the tasks, and restructure work processes so that employees can apply their full range of skills. And then in the next slide, we looked as well, of course, at the skills policy transformation. And so skills policy has traditionally focused on increasing access to training. But if training does not match capability needs, we simply widen the gap between education and employment. So the skills-first approach begins with precision upskilling. So it's really about identifying specific capability gaps in sectors and targeting training accordingly. There are quite a few examples in the paper. You will see that in the paper we have highlighted quite a few examples of all of these policies. Cambodia's Digital Economy and Society Policy Framework, for instance, explicitly links national digital transformation goals with targeted skills development, including a digital skills development roadmap. Then we also need modular, stackable progression pathways, and that really allow workers to build skills progressively and earn recognition along the way. And there as well, there's the example of Denmark's work validating non-formal and informal learning in healthcare, which really shows how alternative pathways can be formally recognized. And it's really digital credentialing systems that are essential because they make skills visible and trusted across the labor market. And finally, we need dynamic forecasting. So it's really about real-time labor market intelligence that informs both providers and learners. And here, as Barney mentioned, Australia's Job and Skills Atlas and Singapore's Job Skills Dashboard point the way forward by integrating near real-time vacancy data, skills demand signals, and occupational projections into accessible user-centered platforms that actually, it's really about translating these complex labor market trends into actionable guidance that support learners and individuals in making informed learning and career choices, and really also to enable training providers to adapt curricula, so also to adapt their delivery modes and capacity in line with these emerging skills needs. Then we looked in the next slide, we actually looked as well precisely into the government and governments which really play multiple coordinating roles to make skills first work. So we identify about 7 of those roles because no single policy lever is enough. It's really moving to a skills-first ecosystem requires governments to take on complementary roles. They must act, for instance, as integrators. So it's really about aligning ministries across education, labor, and industry. And Germany is an interesting example there. They must be also system builders, so developing digital infrastructure for validation and mobility, like Singapore and Denmark have done. But governments must also serve as incentive architects, so really rewarding skills development and utilization, not just enrollment. And again, here Singapore provides strong examples. But quality matters too. So that's as regulators, governments ensure credentials meet standards, and New Zealand has an interesting also set of examples there. Governments can also lead by example, through exemplar adoption, so using skills-based hiring themselves and internal mobility practices in the public sector. And we've seen this, and we're seeing this in the UK and Singapore. They must also act as outcome evaluators, so tracking whether skills are deployed effectively, and that's an approach that both Finland and the Netherlands are currently taking. And finally, they're standard setters, so really building taxonomies and validation frameworks like ESCO is doing in Europe. And it's really about this multidimensional role that is essential for coherence and also long-term success. And so in the next slide, we have this slide really illustrates how having skills infrastructure is not the same as achieving skills deployment. So many countries build excellent training systems, but they still struggle to ensure that skills are actually used productively. And so this matrix here highlights two dimensions, capabilities and coordination. So low coordination and low capability lead to fragmented systems. So it's lots of initiatives, but few results. High capability and low coordination creates pockets of excellence that don't scale. High coordination but low capability results in strong intentions but weak implementation. And so skills first adoption happens only when both dimensions are high. So it really requires aligning industrial labor and skills policy, precision upskilling, skills accounts, dynamic forecasting, value chain capability mandates, and incentives for skills utilization. So the message here is really simple. It's really readiness is not enough. Without coordinated adoption, skills remain potential rather than really achieving impact. And so in the next slide, we wanted to leave you with a few questions, particularly for the panel that sit at the heart of skills first transformation. So first, how do we redefine success? So are we measuring enrollments, or are we measuring whether people can actually use their skills productively? How do we make skills utilization economically rational for firms? So capability development must create business values through incentives, procurement, regulatory frameworks, or productivity gains. Also, how do we build foresight capability? Policymaking must be informed by real-time intelligence about emerging skills, sectoral transitions, and labor market dynamics. So institutionalizing this foresight is essential. And finally, how do we align mandates across ministries and actors? So skills first requires that industrial, labor, and skills policies actually move in sync. And without clarity on who owns what, fragmentation can actually persist. And so with those questions, I'll hand over back to Paul and look forward to the panel discussion. And again, thank you very much for this endeavor, and particularly Barney and the colleagues in Singapore for this. Thanks. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for your insightful sharing. Your perspective set the stage as we move into our panel discussion to explore more on the theme. We now move into our panel discussion on Skill First policy and impact. We are honored to be joined by the esteemed and internationally diverse panel, whose wealth of experience and insight will greatly enrich our conversation today. Ms. Anne Branch, Head of Unit, Union of Skill, European Commission. Sir David Bell, Vice Chair, Skills England. Mr. Johan Ensfield, Vice Chair for Working Group on Education and Skills, Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. And Mr. Zhou Ganwei, Divisional Director, Ministry of Manpower, Singapore. And steering this conversation is our moderator, Associate Professor Terence Ho, Executive Director Designate at the Institute for Adult Learning, and one of the co-authors for Skill First Working Paper 4. This panel brings together perspectives from government, union, and National Skill and Workforce Development Agency, a powerful mix to unpack how Skill First principle can take root across the policy ecosystem and drive real impact. Terence, over to you.
Paul. Yeah, I think I really appreciated the sharing earlier on by my co-authors, and I want to now set some context for the panel discussion to follow. The notion of skills first is gaining traction clearly in countries around the world, as the paper highlights. While it's not yet quite mainstream, I think there are certainly pockets of innovation in skills first practices across different economies and different labor market contexts. The first three working papers on skills first, released by the Center for Skills First Practices at IIL, identify possible gaps and barriers to the adoption of skills first practices, including, for example, signaling failures, coordination deficits, risk asymmetry, measurement gaps, and cultural resistance. But these are not insurmountable challenges. I think we all see that progress, however, will require the coordinated efforts on the part of governments, employers, training providers, as well as intermediaries in the labor market. And as my co-authors have shared, the working paper 4 proposes an integrated policy approach spanning industrial policy, labor policy, and skills policy to support skills first practices. There's a range of interesting examples across different countries. And what's also noteworthy is how some governments in some countries have tried to integrate these policies for clearer alignment and stronger outcomes. We now have an opportunity for a deeper dive into the content of this paper and to draw insights from our distinguished panel members comprising senior policymakers, union representatives, and stakeholders. Now, the purpose of this panel discussion is to discuss the policy impetus, firstly, for adopting skills first practices, as well as any challenges encountered, to also share particularly international experiences in implementing skills first policies and the lessons learned from these experiences, specifically to unpack and examine more closely the policy levers that were outlined to support skills first adoption, and to identify conditions for success and policy or program elements that could be transferable across different contexts so that we can learn from one another. The panel discussion will be structured around three broad segments. I'll first ask panelists to share their perspectives on the key messages and suggestions set out in working paper 4. Next, I'll ask a round of questions to unpack the paper's recommendations, focusing on which policies may be most relevant or readily adoptable, as well as those that represent perhaps new thinking or frontier approaches. And drawing on the 7 roles for policymakers proposed in the working paper, I'll ask some of the panelists to discuss which roles policymakers should assume or prioritize in advancing a skills-first approach. And then we will have time for participants to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A chat function throughout the session. And I'll be selecting some of these to post to the panel members. So I'd like to begin now by inviting each of the panel members to offer your reflections on working paper 4, particularly in relation to your area of work and your home economy. Could I start by inviting Sir David to share your reflections first, please?
Good morning, Terence, and many thanks. I'm afraid I'll have to stay off video because I am having some problems at this end. Can I thank our presenters for an excellent summary of this important piece of work, and it very much resonated with what we are trying to do here in the United Kingdom and in England in particular. The new body set up, called Skills England, of which I am the vice chair, is intended to be that single, authoritative and coordinated voice for all aspects of skills work. And I think that plays very much into the paper and the presentations that we heard earlier. And I think what Skills England is trying to do reflects many of the comments made earlier. So, for example, to become a voice where we bring together all of the intelligence we have about skills, a difficult job in any jurisdiction, but very important that there's some national level coordination of skills intelligence. Then Skills England is seeking to simplify the skills system. And again, I think reflecting the skills first paper, fragmentation, confusion, different routes that are not always into education and training onto employment that are not always understood. So again, an important priority. And then I think the third piece, which very much reflects what the Skills First and our presenters highlighted, is what I'm calling mobilization. In other words, how do you activate all the players in a skills system, from the education and training providers, obviously through to employers, whether they are in the public sector or the private sector, and how does government provide an overlay for that mobilization activity, always remembering our first priority is enabling our fellow citizens to acquire the skills that they need if they are going to succeed in this changing economy.
Thank you very much. Next, could I invite Gang Wei to share your perspectives as a policymaker from Singapore, please?
Thanks, Terence, and I echo Sir David Bell's thanks to the presenters for summarizing this paper in a very clear way. I really appreciate how the paper has framed the problem, but the way I see it, maybe I could suggest another way of breaking down the problem, which is how sometimes we look at it. And it's about breaking down the journey from skills to jobs into three parts, right? So I think over the past 10 years, Singapore has invested very heavily in the middle part of that journey, with just the training itself. Set up many programs, institutions, funding, and access to spur training and spur the supply side of the equation. But I think what's really missing in our ecosystem today is at the two ends of the journey, which is what I call the first mile and the last mile. The first mile is navigation, or kind of what the paper relates to as having a common language. The root cause, I think, is that there's signaling failure. I don't think we have a very well developed and mature language that maps jobs to tasks and skills. We have, I think, invested many efforts in trying to develop this in Singapore. I think it was mentioned that we have a skills and jobs framework and a dashboard. We also have developed a career and skills passport, which is attempts to capture all the employment and training data that individuals have, and linked to their administrative records. As far as we can tell, there are some early signs of success. For example, we have linked the career and skills passport data to online job portals who we've partnered to connect them to jobs. And we've seen that some of those with validated credentials who use the data provided by the system have actually a 1.5 time chance of being shortlisted by prospective employers. So information and overcoming such informational asymmetries is important, especially in a job market where I think credible data is becoming harder to find, especially with a lot of AI-generated resumes and so on. But I think where we are today, we have yet to really institutionalize a deep foresight as a state capability. We have yet to really deploy real-time labor market intelligence to inform investment and manpower planning. And part of this is the governance issue, right? Because the skills data is in the Ministry of Education, labor market data is in the Ministry of Manpower. And as much as we coordinate on the skills and jobs nexus, there are frictions and there are governance issues. So I think that's a tricky problem that we need to resolve. But long term, I think what we really want to move from is what I call going from a skills vocabulary, which we're developing through a taxonomy to really a working grammar and a literature for talking about skills. Then I talk about the last mile, right? So we talked about the first mile, the middle part of the journey. The last mile is utilization. So, workers today, they can acquire new skills, but if the job is not redesigned and employers do not recognize the credential, these skills sit unused. And I think that is a critical challenge that we face, where there are sentiments that after all the training and running on the skills treadmill, people don't find the kind of jobs that they expect. So the connection to the last mile is important, and that's where I think we've been focusing our attentions. So indeed, shifting from I think, what the paper calls skills expansion to skills utilization. You heard about some of the initiatives that we've taken in this area from Dr. Eliza earlier, like PACT. I'd like to flag out a few other instruments that we have put in place. So one is a Skills Future Enterprise Credit. So instead of putting the resources in the hands of individuals to decide what kind of courses to take, we have now put more resources on the business side to incentivize them to upskill their workforce and connect that skilling to business needs. Another tool that we've launched quite recently is Talent Track, which I think is mentioned in the paper. This really helps enterprises to take a look at their existing skill stock, what kind of qualifications and skills the workers have, and use that as a way of designing and structuring their workforce around business transformation needs. This year, we are also rolling out an enterprise and workforce transformation package, which combines all of this with support for job redesign and workforce development. And really the intent is to spur firms to look at how to elevate their workers to drive performance rather than to eliminate them to save costs in this age of automation. And I think in these cases, the principle is the same. Skills policy must be embedded, right, in the logic of enterprise performance. And I think coming back to the key challenge, I think, you know, closing the last mile and the first mile, they're quite fundamentally different problems, right? The first mile is primarily a skills intelligence problem. It's a technical challenge. Closing the last mile is primarily an industrial and labor policy problem. And all of these are scattered across different ministries. In our context in Singapore, it's the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Manpower, where I sit, and the Ministry of Education. So how do we bring this together? In Singapore, we have forums that bring us together, but I think there's much to be desired in terms of the speed of coordination and the tightness of that feedback loop, which is a key challenge that we need to continue to work on. I think I leave you with these thoughts. So again, you know, we've invested a lot in the middle. I think we have to invest a lot more in the first and last mile to close the skills and jobs journey for our workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kang Wei. May I now invite Johan to share your perspectives as well from the broader, perhaps OECD perspective on these issues?
Yes, thank you. I'm Johan Enfelt. I represent the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. So I will try and have a trade union perspective on this. And first of all, thank you for an interesting report and an interesting presentation. And if I, at this point in time, should just summarize a few of my reflections, I would say that this presentation, it started off with a description of the current state. And I think I would like to add a couple of things to what was mentioned about traditional approaches failing and challenges. Because of course, there are parts of the economy where the qualification-centric systems is maybe inadequate, but there are also large parts of society and economy where we actually still need formal qualifications, and that is in healthcare. We also see a lot of that in vocational occupations where we need skilled and trained workers with papers showing what they know. And if we go to the challenge part of this, where 60% of employers cite skills gaps as a barrier, yes, but then we also need to look at what those skills gaps emerge from, and in many cases, especially in Europe, there is a big discussion on lack of staff, basically for elderly care. But what we see from a trade union perspective is that the working conditions in elderly care are not attractive enough for people to want to work there, and that needs to be part of the discussion as well in this case. So then I like the report that has in the presentation you talk about industrial policy, labor policy, and skills policy, and from a trade union point of view, well, what is industrial policy, labor policy, and skills policy together? Well, that is labor market policy. And I think that's what we need to see here. I saw in the report, in some places, it said a labor market policy focuses on employment protection. And if you have your labor market policy only focusing on that, then it will not work. Labor market policy needs to include industrial policy and also skills policy. And of course, the combination of a good skills policy where workers can retrain or upskill and be empowered to do that without having to fund that all by themselves is very important. But also, as was mentioned in the presentation, the solutions to empower employees to move on to a new job with confidence without being hesitant or worrying about financials. So that's very important. But having said that, when we have discussed this with my trade union fellows in this working group that I'm vice chair of, we see a lot of positive potential to enhance labor market, both inclusion of workers' experiences and so on. But we also see a couple of risks that I would shortly like to highlight. And when employers start to focus on very narrow skills, there is a risk that we see a fragmentation of the labor market, and basically that what was once a good job with various tasks to complete during a day will become that will be split up into several persons, which will, if we don't do it the right way, this will make the working conditions worse instead of better. We also see a risk that such fragmentation may lead to undermining collective bargaining agreements and deregulation of professions. So that's also something that we need to look at. But very important, I had a lot of good things in this presentation, and systems to empower individuals to develop their skills so that they can remain relevant in the labor market. That is very important. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Johan. For another union perspective as well, could I invite Anne to comment on the paper and what struck you about the various proposals in the paper?
So thank you very much to the organisers and to the presenters. So very happy to speak here on behalf of the European Commission. And I must say that I found the paper really extremely eloquent and to the point and on point, and resonates very much with much of our work in the European Commission. Perhaps before commenting on the paper, I would just quickly, for the benefit of the audience, which is quite international, I understand, perhaps just clarify that I'm a European Union policymaker, so I'm not coming from the national perspective, but we work with our 27 member states to support them on skills policy. The actual competences for skills policy is very much at the national level, but we do a lot to support their work, not least in light of the fact that we have a European internal market. So that's just a setting. So we work with 27 countries, and we're not on the ground at the grassroots level. Turning to the working paper, so indeed the analysis and recommendations, there's a lot of alignment with our thinking and policies in the European Commission. We have in fact been talking about skills-based approaches since many years. And this is not, of course, I should make a caveat, picking up on something Johan said, that of course qualifications are still very important, and some professions need to be regulated for good reasons, for safety, for example, public health. But nevertheless, we do see that there's a strong case for more flexibility in understanding people's skills in a more flexible way. But we've been working with kind of trying to promote more flexible approaches to understanding people's skills since 15, almost 20 years, for example, through things like the Europass CV, which also gets people to list their skills as well as their qualifications, and the Europass platform, and the ESCO taxonomy, just a couple of examples, or work we've done on validation, encouraging our member states to put in place skills validation systems. So our work on skills goes back quite some time. But just to give you a bit of modern history from the European Commission policy perspective, I think there was a new impetus and urgency to this issue came when the European Commission came with its Green Deal, European Green Deal in 2020, with quite ambitious targets for 2030, 2035, etc. And a realization grew that we wouldn't be able to achieve our climate change objectives unless we actually have people with the skills to do the job, to deliver, to implement, whether it's heat pumps or solar panels, etc., etc. So and suddenly the skill shortages that were appearing meant that there was a real kind of urgency came to this issue. And so, in fact, the Commission felt it was so important politically that we had a European Year of Skills from 2023 to 2024. Now, this then led under this new Commission, which has its mandate began just over a year ago. It also put skills top of the political agenda because of the realization of how important skills are to competitiveness. And the Commission proposed a new EU strategy for skills called the Union of Skills as one of the first 100 days initiatives of its mandate. Again, this shows just how crucial this topic of skills has become for the European Union. And so we very much share the analysis on the skills shortages, gaps and mismatches that are holding back business and organizational development. Of course, there's the issue also of working conditions, which Johan raised. But we do see that we're in a paradigm now where the pace of change is so intense, and it will remain that way, that jobs for life are rarer and rarer. And the reality of the future is that almost everybody will have to upskill and reskill throughout their lives. And most people will be in the labor market for almost 4 decades. So this is really something that we need to have upskilling and reskilling systems and flexible systems to allow adults to adapt to this reality. And then we also recognize the problem, this transformation gap that you identify in the paper, where on the one hand, there are skills shortages in emerging domains and skills underutilization among displaced workers. And we do see that there is some scope for helping to smooth these workers may well have skills that can be used in these other industries, but we need better matching mechanisms to facilitate these kind of transitions. So we agree that the rapid pace of change means that we need to have a fresh approach to valorizing people's skills. So very much in line with your recommendations. And we have numerous more initiatives in this respect, but perhaps this will come back to that later. And perhaps just the final point I would make is that a comment on the problem of fragmented governance and disjointed policy making, which we very much agree and see this as a problem. In the Commission, we're trying to work closely across Commission departments because we see all Commission departments are interested in skills. So almost any policy initiative that comes out now has a section on skills. So we see this within the European Commission, but we see also at the national level that this kind of lack of joined up policy makings undermines long-term effective reforms. And again, we can come back to that later in the discussion. And also that there is a lack of effective foresight and use of skills intelligence in making skills strategies, which is something also we have proposals on this in the Union of Skills. So perhaps I'll leave it at that for the time being, because I think we'll add some of the other things we will come back to in the next rounds.
Thank you, Anne. I think we can already see from this first round that there's some common challenges and points of interest across the panel members that have been brought up. Now I'd like to turn back to Sir David to ask about the policy levers that Working Paper 4 has set up. And they are, of course, industrial policy, labor policy, skills policy, and there are further details under each domain. Which of these levers do you think are particularly relevant and readily adoptable, and which may already be quite well established in the UK's context?
Well, the UK has decided to shape its skills strategy around 10 priority areas. 8 of those are in the government's industrial strategy. with the additional 2 areas of construction and health and social care. And I think there is a sense that whilst there are other areas of the economy that are incredibly important, one can think of tourism, one can think of leisure, hospitality, retail, and the like, there had to be some sense of priority given. So I think there's an interesting policy choice, which in a sense, Terence, becomes a lever because you give priority to certain areas of activity. I think the other interesting piece, and I do think this is touched upon in the Skills First paper, is moving, as it were, away from a consideration simply about volumes. In other words, how many people can we actually train, retrain, educate, re-educate, to one much more focused on the particular kinds of pathways that are relevant for particular people. And just to pick up the last comment that Anne made about upskilling, I think that is tremendously important. And I'm not sure we've quite yet got the policy levers in place to fix that. To give one example, however, in the UK, we've now been in England, rather, we've been introducing something called the lifelong learning entitlement, which is a way for every individual to, as it were, if they chose to, modularize their learning and take it in bite-sized chunks at different stages in their working life. Now, for many people, that might be to utilize a fair amount of your lifelong learning entitlement at the beginning of a career or a college qualification, a degree or a college qualification. But for others, they might use that at different stages in life. And I think that's one of the, a helpful attempt to manage this question of how are we going to keep training, retraining, skilling, reskilling as people go through their working lives. And I think powerfully made the point about the length of the working life for most people in the future, the number of changes that are likely to happen in working life. And that's before we get to what Skills England have described as the mega trends: demographic change, climate change, technological change, that are clearly going to be disrupting the skills market. And I think, Terence, one of the things that comes out of this sort of conversation is what are we going to do to deal with an increasingly unpredictable world that will have direct consequences on the skills that people need to be able to cope with it.
David. Now turning to Gang Wei. Singapore already has elements of the various policy levers, but which, in your view, represent some new thinking or approaches that could be considered for adoption in Singapore?
Thanks, Terence. So as I mentioned, I think our primary investment over the past 10 years has been on Skills Future. We now have very generous pathways for individual access to lifelong learning, including training allowances, right, that allow those above 40 years old to go for long-form training or having half of their last income paid up to a certain cap. So these are pretty... I think we have very much prioritized the supply side in line with our general stance in socioeconomic policy to prioritize building up supply. What we are missing on, as I mentioned earlier, is the first and last mile. So in the first mile, what we've launched more recently is this movement called Career Health, which some of you might be familiar with. And this is really an attempt to shift the mindset around career planning such that it is much more preventive instead of reactive, and that you, I mean, it's kind of a preventive health analog to in the employment space, right? Instead of waiting for acute shock, by which time it may be quite difficult for you to pivot and reskill into a new job. Upfront planning, career guidance, and understanding the vulnerabilities that you might face in a mid-career phase, and kind of taking preemptive action to prevent that. That has been one of the key priorities for the Ministry of Manpower, and that really is about taking care of the first mile of the problem that I mentioned. As for the last mile, we have, I think we have been thinking quite hard, and this is a bit more recent, about how we leverage the broader ecosystem to do active labor market policy and placement. So far, we have relied very heavily on our public employment services and just in Workforce Singapore, as well as the E2I, which is it's a job placement institution that is kind of run by the unions. And that has been our primary model for supporting job placements. I think with the shift in our demographic towards more PMEs, towards more diverse kind of job profiles, and also more complex industry structures and occupations, we think that we probably have to move beyond a very public-focused kind of job matching infrastructure and see how we can better tap on the private sector, including online job portals, including recruitment and headhunting agencies that might serve certain segments of PMEs better and white-collar workers better. So that has been a bit of a shift. I mean, traditionally, we've been quite good at placing rank and file workers, which are in quite a liquid labor market. You know, the displaced worker gets placed relatively easily into another job of a similar skill. But in the PME sector, especially with more specialized skills, the labor market is much more illiquid, and much more specialized support might be needed. And hence, that's why we're looking at a lot more at the private sector for improving that last mile job matching, and as well as the skills navigation. The other thing that we want to do, apart from expanding services, is to increase the ability of people to self-help, right? And that's where the data infrastructure really comes into play. Empowering people to actually hold the skills information in their own hands, enabling them to self-serve and use digital tools, in partnership with job portals, LinkedIn, and so on, to help themselves plan. And I think given the educational profile of our workforce, the evolving educational profile of our workforce, I think that is something that we can lean on more going forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tao, for the insights from Singapore. Turning now to Anne, since you have the benefit of EU-wide perspective, 27 member states, the working paper 4 proposes 7 roles for policymakers. So this was covered in the slides. Which, in your view, are the roles which the policymakers ought to prioritize, you think, in advancing a skills-first approach?
Well, regarding the 7 government roles that were identified, I think they were very relevant, extremely relevant. And I can also see how some of them are applicable to us at the European Commission. But perhaps here what I wanted to pick up on was some of the things we are doing further to the Union of Skills that are kind of relevant to the kind of recommendations. And so, for example, we propose a new EU governance for skills in the Union of Skills. So I wanted to kind of just talk a bit about that to show how it taps into some of the recommendations. So, for example, this issue of coordinated skills intelligence, strengthening system responsiveness, multi-stakeholder governance, strengthening policy alignment, and stable governance and long-term policy commitments to enable better coordination. So we really recognize that this fragmentation is an issue, and it undermines good policy making and the effectiveness of reforms. And we recognize that the urgency of the skills challenges, the speed with which things are changing, and we need to kind of, as you rightly say, so much of the focus in the past has been on the supply side, but there's also this kind of demand side we need to also work on and make them match. And we know that this is a field where reforms can be very slow. But we want to nevertheless kind of try to bring a better system responsiveness. So there's 3 things that we are introducing under this new governance of the Union of Skills. So one is that we're setting up a European Skills Intelligence Observatory, which is trying to see indeed what are the real, to try to get as close to understanding the real-time needs of the labour market and what the kind of, and trying to look at how that matches with the skills supply. There's a lot of skills intelligence that exists, in fact. So the idea here is to try to draw together all the existing sources of skills intelligence, rather than necessarily creating new skills intelligence, but to pull together all these disparate, fragmented systems and try to optimize that better for a European perspective. Then secondly, we're setting up a European skills high-level board, which will be comprised of some key stakeholders, so coming from business, social partners, and education and training institutions. So here we want them to look at this skills intelligence, and we want to hear also from them, as they're close to the labour market realities, what they think, what they see as the kind of the needs now and emerging. And then finally, we want all of this kind of intelligence to feed into our EU level policy coordination mechanism. We have something called the European semester, which is the way we work with member states to work with them to identify policy reforms and investments. And then EU funds, structural funds and cohesion funds are used to support those reforms. And so now we have with the Union of Skills a new human capital recommendation we'll have every year, which will feed into this broader economic and social policy coordination mechanism, which is very good because it shows it will put more of a highlight on skills and try to really support member states in trying to be more, make their systems more responsive. Perhaps I would also just add that we have worked for numerous years trying to promote countries to have national skills strategies, so whole of government approaches, because of some of the problems identified in the paper. And there we've worked with the OECD and we've given funding support, for example, for the OECD to work with countries to introduce national skills systems. So that we've been doing for quite a long time. But in any case, with the Union of Skills, I wanted to highlight these aspects because I think it really is trying to say, listen, we know this stuff. We have got to shift the dial. So this is what we are trying to do to try to kind of make the systems more responsive. And there are other things I could talk about, policy measures related to skills, but perhaps that will come back in the final round.
Thanks, Anne, for sharing about the observatory and also the coordination efforts across Europe. Johan, we all know that there are limits to what the government or policymakers can achieve on their own. Which of the roles of the policymaker for government do you think require further capability or maybe efforts on the part of other stakeholders in order to succeed?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think this the part of the report which outlines these roles is very interesting, and I think in the question I had, which was most difficult, and I would say that the most difficult and most important role is the integrator, because as I said earlier, this is not, we cannot put this into boxes like labor policy or industrial policy or education policy. We need labor market policy, and that actually spans a wide range of areas, and depending on your country, it may also, like one area that can be really important. Let's say we have a industrial investments in a part of a country where not so many people live. Then you need to have housing policy, you need to have childcare, you need to have all of that to actually make it attractive for people to reskill, to be able to move there and to take a job. So the integrator, I would say, is the most difficult one and most important one. When it comes to things that may require additional capacity, then it's the role that was said, example adopter, and which is basically the public sector as a good example for skills first policy, and that of course in the paper it was very focused on the hiring part, and I would like to emphasize that if public sector is going to actually drive this change, then the public sector also need to be good at the upskilling and reskilling and transition part over the working working life for employees, not only the hiring part. And in order to do that, then of course the funding of the public sector is a critical issue. If we are going to improve like working conditions in, let's say, elderly care, well, that may cost some money, and that needs to come from somewhere. So that's an example of an additional capability, I would say. Then there are, of course, roles that actually could probably be done by social partners in countries. This depends a lot on how the labor market works in different countries, I would say. But when you have strong social partners, then both building systems and incentives is something that the social partners already do. And I think it's important that you have this tripart way of working with government, employer organizations, and trade unions.
Thanks,
I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yep. Now it's time to take in some questions from the participants today. And we have a few questions that have come in, and I'll just read the ones with the most votes. Let's see how far we can go with these questions. And I invite the panelists, any one of you can feel free to jump in to answer first or add on later on. So the first question is, the point on looking at skills as dynamic and not static is an interesting one. Could any of the panelists provide examples of where looking at skills dynamically rather than static skills has been successfully done? Are there some examples of new dynamic skills from your various countries that you're familiar with? Anybody would like to have a go first?
Maybe
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch all of that from my side, but I see David wants.
Maybe I just recap really quickly, very briefly. The question is really one on treating skills as dynamic rather than static. Which countries have succeeded in this kind of dynamic look at skills? Are there examples of new skills that have emerged through this process? David, please.
Yes, I mean, just a couple of examples, Terence, from the UK. Skills England has recently brokered a major training package in AI so that people at different levels will be able to access some capability in AI. This is not full-length degree programs, but this is validated short courses that give people the capability to react and respond. Another maybe quite different example, many households in the country are adapting new forms of heating systems. So people who were traditionally trained as engineers to install gas-fueled systems are now having to retrain to install different kinds of heating systems in domestic and commercial appliances. And again, there's been quite a good move there to adapt and change the training programs so that workers who've got one set of skills can hold on to them and still utilize them, but it can also learn new skills at the same time. And I think this picks up a more general theme, if I might, and that's just briefly around the question of the length of qualifications. We will still have, as Johan and others have said, the requirement for full-length qualifications, in particular professional disciplines. But I think in my own sector, for example, higher education, we're having to adapt to the requirement and demand for shorter qualifications that meet evolving and changing skills. So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for training and education providers, to be agile, to be responsive, to be fleet of foot, and to be able to meet changing economic and skills demands.
Thanks, David, for those examples from England. Anne, would you like to add? Sorry, Anne, I think you're muted.
Sorry, so from the European Union perspective, we very much agree that skills are dynamic, should need to be a dynamic, not static thing. And hence, this is why, you know, our former European skills agenda and now our latest strategy, the Union of Skills, very much emphasizes this. We have, for example, a section on upskilling and reskilling adults. And there are various initiatives through which we've tried to promote this approach. So, for example, the European individual learning accounts, the Elisa mentioned, the French have this, is called, they have a system like that already, the compte formation individuelle, and it sounds rather like what David was talking when David referred to the new kind of lifelong learning entitlement. We basically have a recommendation that all our member states have agreed, where they aim to work towards have this kind of system, which would enable people to have some agency over their upskilling and reskilling needs. This is to kind of complement what is done by companies or employers, because of course we know that a lot of training does take place there, but there may be people who want to transition into a new job, which is not something that's provided by their employer, and that they need to be given the idea is to give people the means to have some agency over their reskilling needs if their professional pathway is going to they want to go somewhere else with it. Then similarly, we have also a European approach to micro-credentials. It's voluntary, but there's a council recommendation which recognizes the need for this kind of shorter courses, which various participants have talked about, because if we want people to retrain quickly, these kind of short courses, micro-credentials, are extremely important. And then at the end of this, to get a validated outcome which can be valued and recognized. So that's something else. It's also very part of a dynamic approach to upskilling and reskilling. Then we also have an initiative, the Pact for Skills, which is also trying to leverage public-private partnerships. And here we work with them. These are grassroots initiatives by employers working with trade unions, social partners, and other players in the field to develop skills solutions for key industrial ecosystems. And here again, it's based on the premise is that this is something that the public sector cannot do alone. This is something where it's a shared responsibility between the public sector has a role, the private sector has a role, and individuals also have a role to play in managing their careers over their lifetimes. But of course, they need to be given the tools and the frameworks to support them. So those are just a few tasters of some of the things that I would say demonstrate how we're trying to support this kind of dynamic approach to skills. Thank you.
Thanks for the insights. Johan, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think sometimes there's a risk with this discussion on skills first that we make it more complicated than it actually is. I think a very good example on dynamic skills is actually healthcare. There has been a lot of medical development, new medicines, new treatments, new equipment, which means that anybody working in a hospital, whether it's a surgeon, a doctor, or nurse, or nursing assistant, they have learned constantly over the years to keep up with the development in their field of expertise. So this is actually not something new. The same goes with many other occupations. I think what Sir David Bell mentioned about let's take, for example, electricians. We have seen in many countries examples of like upskilling electricians to deal with solar panels and how to install them, and that is like a fairly quick training, but it's an effective way of building on your existing formal skill to adapt it to new technology. And I think that's what we need to continue to do, and we need to both have the responsibilities for the employer organizations to take employers to take part in this, but also for employees to be empowered to take part in this, whether it is to upskill in their current occupation or if they want to reskill to try another occupation. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Kang Wei?
Thanks. Yeah, I thought I should say something. I thought maybe the question could be parsed and unpacked at a few levels. So at the first level, it's about the substance of the skills. The skill itself might not be dynamic. I mean, the skill might be static, but the context around it and the utilization of it is dynamic. And so as Johan said, I mean, certain skills are quite transferable across contexts. So one example that came to mind is the care profession, right? I mean, so during COVID, we pivoted thousands of flight crew from service staff, on air crew, right, to care jobs, because they were seen as being very good at frontline service and delivering care. And there was a huge demand in the healthcare sector during COVID. And we did that quite successfully. Some of them even stayed on beyond COVID in the sector. And as Johan pointed out, electricians and plumbers, there's a skill set that actually can be applied to new areas of demand, like solar installation, data centers, electric vehicles. And that maybe requires a bit of a top-up, but actually the underlying skill sets and the kind of technical expertise can be transferable. So I think maybe the demand side is probably more dynamic than the supply side in a way. And part of the challenge really is to look at how we can morph and evolve skills, which tend to shift a bit slower in terms of shifting the skills content to match demand as quickly as possible. And this requires quite a good analysis on adjacencies. And then there's another layer of dynamism, which is how we forecast, right? Again, I think it's very hard to centrally plan and centrally forecast skills for the entire economy. How we've done it is to use administrative data, but our taxonomies may not evolve quite as quickly as the economy and as the economy does. So there are different ways of trying to measure and kind of identify skills. Apart from the centralized ways of doing it through government systems, I mean, one example that comes to mind is how LinkedIn does it, which is by community verification. It's kind of more decentralized way of identifying and validating skills based on people that you know and people who can kind of vouch for your skills. Of course, that's in a relatively narrow area of more white-collar kind of professions, but there are ways, I think, that we can do it in somewhat of a more Web 3.0 way, which is decentralized rather than through a centralized validation system. And then the last part of dynamism that came to mind is how we intervene and how training can keep up with the pace of change in terms of skills demand and new skills that need to be developed. So I mean, we talked a little bit about moving to more kind of quick short form courses for training, but I think that even that is not enough going forward. I think the primary way of closing that feedback loop quickly has to be to train through industry and to do a lot more on-the-job training, just-in-time training. And for that, I think putting the resources in the hands of key training partners in industry, having a shift from legacy training institutions to employer-driven training, I think that is something that will be quite interesting. In Singapore, we have these what we call Skills Future Queen Bees, which are large companies that train for the industry beyond their own needs, including for the supply chain. And I think that is a good way for the skills gap, to really be in touch with what the industry needs without that translation gap that goes through industry down to the ministry and bureaucratic planning and down to the training institutions. That feedback loop, I think, has become far too long to make sense in this rate, given this rate of change. So I think 3 levels of dynamism we have to look at. There's the substance of skills, there's the forecasting of skills, and also how we intervene and train and develop skills. Thanks.
Thank you all. I'm quite mindful that we only have about 5 minutes left for this panel. So I want to sort of try to summarize a few of the questions that were asked. They cluster around a common theme, and maybe invite each of the panelists to share thoughts about that and or parting reflections on any other topic you wish to bring up quite briefly. And so this nexus of questions around how we can make skills-first practices take root when the credential-based models are so entrenched. How can we get employers organizations to measure skills, utilize the skills of the employees when there could be some inertia or resistance to change. May I invite each of the panelists to either address this or share any parting thoughts? And we can go back to Sir David, please.
Yes, well, thanks very much, Terence, and thank you again for hosting such an excellent seminar. I think when it comes to mobilizing employers, I think we do have a degree of tension here, insofar as employers quite rightly will want speed, they want pace, they want agility, but at the same time, those of us who have system-wide responsibilities must keep an eye on quality. But I think as system leaders, we've got to be careful that we don't over-engineer the quality of requirements that we've got. And to be honest, governments do have a tendency to over-engineer quality requirements. So I think there's an interesting tension to address here. My last comment, if I might, relates to what I would call the disengaged. Much of this conversation today has been about those who want to engage, are already engaged either in employment or in skills education and training. But we know, certainly in our country, and I'm sure this will be the case in many jurisdictions, that there are young people who are just not engaged at all, either because they've got poor entry-level education qualifications or for a reason that they might have dropped out. And we also know of adults who have been unemployed for quite a long period of time and are completely disengaged from the skills system. So I think there's a big challenge for policymakers there, Terence, and maybe that's a subject for a future seminar.
Thank you, David. Anne, please.
Yeah, perhaps I would, perhaps a couple of things. One thing I would advocate is the plea for consistency and long-term commitment, because, well, we know that often this is an area where reforms take time. And we see that sometimes the reforms are victims of political cycles. And so this is a problem. And so, you know, at the European level, we've tried to, through the way we work with member states through the EU kind of cohesion funds, here we kind of embed reforms as part of over a longer time scale, which kind of transcends national political cycles. So it's something that hopefully helps. But this is a real kind of, there is a need for an awareness that understanding that our investments here need to be long-term. So I think, therefore, at the European level, my diagnosis, when I read the policy paper and heard the presentation, is that I think we're kind of, our diagnosis of the problems and solutions are broadly the right ones, and now we have to keep backing them. So something like these individual learning accounts, we have to keep supporting member states in setting them up, because it is complex, it takes time, it's expensive, it requires quite a lot of systemic rethinking. But I think we need to continue that support to member states. I think we need to recognize this issue of disengaged individuals that David mentioned is a real one. We've seen, like with the European Year of Skills, the problem of individual motivation is a big one. In some countries, the support is there. There's a lot of support, but people don't want to. Some of them are just traumatized by their experiences at school and of institutions. And so, for example, we are doing some work on trying to promote innovative community learning spaces to kind of reach out to people who don't want to go through formal settings. So that's another thing. And I think that, personally, I think that something like European digital credentials can help over the long run. I mean, we have actually European digital credentials that organizations and countries can use. It exists, but the rollout is, it needs a much more rollout. And I think something like this, having your credentials in a wallet, you know, micro credentials as well recognized in a wallet on your phone, is something that could help kind of mindsets change. So I think that could be something important in the longer run. And for member states to do more on validation of skills, because we see that, you know, we kind of know that validation needs to happen, but a lot of countries are underinvesting in it. And so this means capturing the value of these kind of informally, non-formally acquired skills is going missed. So I would say that's another important thing. So perhaps I'll leave it at that because other people need to come in too.
Thank you so much, Anne. Johan, would you like to give some parting comments?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this has been a very interesting discussion. I think one of the risks of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that this leads to a fragmentized working positions, which would then increase the number of people working in part-time or working in gig conditions. And just to as a parting remark here in the report, it says that we need to ensure that gig and part-time workers have access to fair pay and enhanced opportunities. And of course, as a trade unionist, I'm not at all against that. But the real problem here is that we have those gig and part-time occupations. So what the policy, there need to be a policy and work among the social partners to make sure that more people have access to permanent employments, which will make them more secure in the labor market, and will make them more. It will also be more likely for themselves to invest in upskilling and reskilling if they have a permanent employment where they can feel secure and they can build and on which they can build a life with their families. So I think that would be my closing remark here. Thank you.
Kang-wei, could you give us a brief last word, please?
Sure. I mean, I think the question is about inertia. I think on one of the key barriers that we face is really this deepest challenge is really cultural. I think in many of our labor markets, hiring, promotion, decisions are still very much based on qualifications rather than skills. And this is very deeply embedded. And I don't think it's irrational. I think credentials do reduce the information costs for employers and HR departments, but it does create a structural bias against skills-based mobility. And it undercuts the kind of returns that we have for non-traditional pathways. I think the key is, again, to reduce the cost of information and the cost of adopting systems that help you to assess skills in a more sophisticated way beyond the shorthand of credentials. Credentials are still important, but I think we have to break down that shorthand to what lies underneath. And I think I'm optimistic. I think the key is really if our labor market continues to be at least in our context, continues to be tight, employers will need to find ways of tapping on untapped labor pools. And I think across the world with aging populations, expanding that definition of what is a skilled worker, I think there will be impetus to that. And I think if the incentives and the cost and benefit skews, and there may be a tipping point where skills first practice may be a lot more mainstream. I think I'll leave the panel with that comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Kang-wei. I would like to express my deep appreciation to the distinguished panel members today for giving us a much more granular feel for the challenges that lie ahead in the skills first journey, as well as the many exciting ideas and opportunities that can advance this agenda. On that note, I'd like to hand back the time to Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Terence. And a big thank you to all our panelists for such a lively and insightful discussion. Your perspective and experience have added immense depth to today's conversation. To wrap up today's discussion, I would now like to invite Dr. Gok Soon Joo, Senior Director, Special Project at Institute for Adult Learning, to share her closing remark. Dr. Gok, please.
Thank you, everybody. I'm listening in so closely and trying to take notes. There are some questions asked by the participant whether we'll be publishing the insights from the discussion. Yes, we will. We'll be summarizing the insight discussion, and we'll also be recording. We have recorded the panel discussion, and we'll be posting on IAL's YouTube, and also make available the insight report on our website. So I don't want to go too much into the summary, but personally there are three takeaways I got down the paper. I think number one, as a panelist mentioned, is the importance of integrating all relevant policies to make skill first work. And really the role of integrator and how to integrate it remains a difficult one, but it's worth attempting. So that's number one. Number two is to to continue to enhance the supply side policy and services. It is because it's not done yet, and while start to prototyping the demand side practice change, especially what I think Gang will talk about the both and the last mile, the first mile and the last mile. I think this was worthy for us to think about it carefully. And the last thing I took away is the need to really build up the capacity to be able to utilize data to foresight talent and skills need to inform various policy and program. I think I'll just stop here as 3 takeaways for myself. And more importantly is on behalf of the Institute for Adult Learning at the University of Social Sciences, I'd like to thank the 3 co-authors have been spending time with us, different time zones from Australia to Paris and Singapore to put together this paper. It's not easy. We've been working for months. And then also the many contributors that we have listed in the report that help to review the paper. And I think equally important is please follow us continuously because there are 2 other papers coming soon. One is on Skill First, the working paper number 5, where we look into opportunity for collective actions. In it, we're trying to discuss also the integrator's role. How can it be done? Secondly, another paper coming soon is we are seriously looking into, in order to support Skill First, what other research studies and R&D development, which is prototyping project, is necessary for us to come together. So just look out for these 2 papers, and from here we are calling out for all partners globally, locally, to come together and say that what we can do together. And on that, I will hand back to Paul. Paul, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. God, for bringing the session to such a thoughtful close. To all our speaker panelists and to all of you joining us from different corners of the world, thank you for being part of this global conversation on the future of skills. We hope today has sparked new ideas, fresh perspectives, and new possibilities for advancing Skill First policy. As shared by Dr. God, stay tuned for Working Paper 5, Skill First Opportunity for Collective Action, which will continue this important conversation. Before you go, we invite you to share your thoughts and feedback on today's roundtable. And with that, this concludes our roundtable. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night wherever you are. Thank you.